was in class with some of my worship students recently, and I posed to them a question. I asked them, I said, how long does it take for you to become a Christian? And that began a lively discussion and not a few hands going up. And I mean, we're good frontier worship, revivalistic kind of people around here. So everybody said, well, as soon as you accept Jesus Christ. And I then went on to talk to them about the early years of Christianity, its first 500-600 years, and the worship experiences that they had. And back in those days, it was a 3-year process to become a Christian. You became what was called a catechumenate, somebody who went in and was preparing to be a Christian. You were a hearer of the word. You spent your time being instructed in the Word, being instructed in the faith. Around here at Asbury, we talk about Christian formation a lot. Well, it was a 3-year process for those early believers. They wanted to do all of these kinds of things to prepare people for understanding and for knowing. So after 3 years of going through this process, after 3 years of doing what needed to be done, they finally came down to the point and the place where these catechumenates, these hearers of the word, who during this 3 years, they're separated from the believers. They don't worship with them. They can't take communion. They don't greet one another with a kiss of peace. None of the kinds of things that became normal for their fellowship together as believers. During these 3 years, these catechumenates couldn't do that. But after 3 years, when it finally came to the point that they were ready and that they were prepared, then came this great day when they would be baptized. And the baptisms always occurred on Easter Sunday morning, well before the worship service would take place. And these catechumenates would gather and they would go down for immersion in this baptism. And they would be asked to renounce Satan. They would be quizzed on their what they had come to understand, what they had been taught. And then finally came that wonderful and glorious moment when they would be baptized, the culmination of 3 years of preparing to be a Christian. And they would come out of the water in these practices. They were baptized 3 times, kind of a Trinity experience for them. And then they would be anointed with oil. Anointed with oil as a symbol of the presence of God in their lives in this commitment. Then they would go and get dressed. They'd get out of their wet clothes and they would dress. And for the first time in 3 years, in some cases for the first time ever, they would be able to walk into the church, not be separated from the believers, but would be able to walk in and worship with those who were members of the household of faith. An incredible experience for them. They would go up and they would stand in front of the bishop. The bishop would quiz them. He would talk to them. They would be again quizzed on their faith and on their belief. And then they would be able to take communion for the very first time. Communion with their brothers and their sisters now in the faith. And then after taking communion, they would give the kiss of peace, receive the kiss of peace, and fully and completely be part of this wonderful worshiping community. Sometimes I wonder if we make being a part of the community just too simple a thing. Maybe there's something that we ought to consider, some steps that we ought to think about for people to come in to the full breadth and depth of what it means to be a Christian. We've almost disdained a little bit of our discipleship in Christian formation. Sunday school in some places seems to be a thing of the past. Wednesday evening Bible studies been replaced by small group home Bible studies, even Sunday evening services. You talk to some people that are young enough and they don't even know what you mean by a Sunday evening service. Things have changed in the way in which we go about doing our worship and doing our gathering and doing our discipleship. But I wonder if we haven't shortchanged some of those that are coming in. I don't think we necessarily need to make it a 3-year process. That seems a little extreme, and I certainly come from a tradition that says that if you accept Jesus Christ, you're a Christian. But there has to be some greater preparation. In this period, in this time, what ministers are facing, what lay people are facing, there has to be a greater depth of understanding and of knowing and of being able to share what it is that God has done in your life and what it is that you know that God has taught and is teaching you. And so I think it's important for us to remember that it hasn't always been the case where when you walk in, and as long as you declare you want to be part of this church, we're happy to have you to be a church member and here are your tithing envelopes. At some point it has to be, what do you know? What have you learned? What have you dedicated? How do you understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ? And can you articulate that in such a way that that you can influence somebody else in terms of what they understand, what they might know, and what they need to believe? We're trying to prepare people for ministry by teaching them that regardless of what your liturgical aspect is of worship, you still have to concentrate on people being able to learn, know, express, and understand what it is that they're doing when they're coming into a worship experience. Worship is more than just sitting in the pew. Worship is about being part of the community, about being part of the faith, about being part of the faithful, and about knowing Jesus Christ and knowing what it means to serve Him.